Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette number 168, where we read and review philosophy live on air. This week, because of Black Lives Matter in America, we're doing philosophy of race. So let's go get philosophy of race. Let's see what we have. Philosophy of race. It is getting warm here in New York. Like, it is really getting, it's like it was almost 90 degrees Fahrenheit today. Which, I mean, I guess that's getting into the 30s in the Celsius things. Let's see, here we go. Publication year, is this the right way to do it? Get all the forthcoming things that way. Yeah, I think this is right. Let's get a few pages in. And then we'll get some stuff I haven't seen yet. Yeah, because they have all these reviews on the Free to Be You and Me. Gauche is, yeah, Introduction to Gauche. So it's a review or whatever it is. It's on that book. Let's see what else we have. It's got a few pages because I already looked through the first few. It's a lot of journal like Contemporary Political Philosophy or whatever. Put out a bunch of book reviews recently. I don't usually do book reviews, or I try to avoid just review articles if I can help it, because it's hard to because I'm reviewing the review, and it's, sometimes it's not as much stuff to just like rereading what they're saying. All right, so we've got signifying within African American classical music, Lincoln Gates, hip hop, and Parkinson. Let's see if this is available. Boo, not available. Clicky work. Nope. Okay. Too bad. Review. Oh, applied philosophy. Resolving the tension between white people's active investment in racial inequality and white ignorance. A response to Marzia, Milazzo. Okay. Review. Deracializing visual art. Spectral percent. Let's see. Reparations for police killings. That's introduction. Caden Honk. Do you know Daisy? I do not know Daisy. Caden Honk. Welcome though. Decolonial, neoliberal. Alright. Let's see, there's a bunch from art and contemporary thing. Black rights, white wrongs, a critique of racial liberalism. Alrighty. Let's see what that is. Is that a... Yeah, there's a contemporary political theory. Is that another review? Don't know. Let's find out. Daisy me rolling. Oh. Awesome. This is a review. Nope, not available. Let's see, reparations for police killings. Let's see. Ooh, it is here. Let's see. Alright, so we've got 14 pages. Let's take a look real quick. Welcome, Caden. What we do is I read a philosophy paper and we talk about that paper, and that's what happens here, basically. This is kind of long. It's these double... Maybe I'll try and get some a little shorter, because it's 15 pages, but double column per page, so... But it's something to consider. Nope, not available here. Let's see what we got. Let's see. Ooh. 11 pages. I like that. Okay, so this is what we'll do. Let's see, is there anything else right here? Did I... Oh, these are old ones. Okay. So I like this one here. Journal of Applied Philosophy. I don't know. Did I do something else from Applied Philosophy? I don't remember. Maybe one. No, I did Applied Logic. Alright, let's... Yeah. There we go. Okie dokie. Okay. Download first. Save file. Okay, if you want to get the link, it's there. And also, if you're not here right now, then you can get the link by typing !paper, and it'll pop back up in the chat. It'll also be below the video if you're watching later on, like the YouTubes. So. Cool. Okay, no abstract. Introduction. In this article, I respond to Marzia Milazzo's article on white ignorance, white shame, and other pitfalls in critical philosophy of race, published in this journal in August 2017. In our article, Milazzo interrogates conceptualizations of whiteness and racism that are dominant in critical philosophies of race. She regards that a significant body of the scholarship obfuscates structural dimensions of racism by equating racism with individual intentional acts of discrimination. As Milazzo explains, this individualized understanding of racism diverts attention from embedded structural and institutional racism, enabling these processes to continue unimpeded and the practices that uphold them to remain uninterrogated. Yeah, if you're out there in the chat, please, you're welcome to ask questions. I will try to answer them, but as per usual, this is my first time reading it too. In particular, Milazzo critiques studies that frame racism as a moral dilemma, chiefly focusing on Vice's article, How Do I Live in This Strange Place? Studies such as Vice's admonish whites, encouraging effective responses such as white guilt or white shame as opposite and adequate responses to white privilege. Yet, as Milazzo states, these effective responses have no impact on racial inequality or the mechanisms by which it is reproduced. The lived experiences of both privilege and disadvantage are perpetuated. In contrast, Milazzo advocates disrupting privilege via decolonialization and redistributing material resources. Did I not get the name here? No, let me, one sec. I forgot. I didn't even get the author's name on this. Let me just throw that up over here real quickly. There we go. Okay. Thus far, I'm in agreement with Milazzo. However, Milazzo extends her critique of white guilt and white shame to additional concepts within critical race studies: white privilege, white habits, white ignorance, and white invisibility. I argue that these latter concepts differ from white guilt and white shame in crucial ways. Most importantly, these concepts can be effective tools for dismantling white dominance. Milazzo asserts that within critical philosophy of race, all 6 concepts are theorized in ways that minimize white people's active interest in reproducing the status quo. Milazzo critiques this approach, emphasizing white people's vigilance and self-consciousness in maintaining the racialized status quo. I argue that Milazzo's emphasis results in individualization and moralization, despite her critique of this style of analysis. While whites have an obvious interest in maintaining our racialized privilege, I concur with scholars, including those cited by Milazzo, such as Outlaw, Leonardo, Sullivan, and Mills, who contend that this interest can be below the level of conscious awareness. I conclude that Milazzo's aim of decolonizing can be achieved without the need to demonstrate white people's active interest or intentions. Indeed, echoing Milazzo's critique of effective responses to racism, I argue that focusing on intentions is counterproductive as it obscures the structural forces which maintain the racialized status quo regardless of intent. I contest Milazzo's critique of white privilege, white ignorance, and white invisibility. My aim is to redeem these concepts as valuable tools in the project of decolonialization. Alright, so it looks like the argument here, the argumentative strategy, is that when things get too individualized, you're getting down to the personal level, it sort of misses the forest for the trees. So you're looking at like individual trees basically, but then you're missing like that there's a whole structural racist forest. So what's happening here is if you actually get too particular, too individual, or individualization, and if you get too moral and individual, which is focused too much on individual people, then you're going to miss that there's a larger systematic thing going on here. Okay, so let's see how this argument plays out. Standpoint. As a white woman living in Australia, I share Vice's question of how to live with the knowledge that I belong to an unjustly privileged racial group. I continue to benefit from Aboriginal dispossession, while my status as a white woman living in Australia is a constant repudiation of Indigenous sovereignty. Nevertheless, I eschew resolving my discomfort through guilt and or shame as advocated by Vice. The process of confession, catharsis, and redemption not only recenters the white subject, it also functions to negate complicity with the privileges of whiteness. Rather, I concur with scholars who posit that white people are not responsible for our enculturation in entitlement and superiority. Nevertheless, we are responsible for decolonizing our minds and for using our privileged position to work towards dismantling the system that produces it. This article is a minor contribution to that effort. As Ahmed explains, it is also important to acknowledge that despite my critique of social structures which benefit white people in Australia at the expense of non-white peoples, I am not outside of these systems. Rather, I continue to accrue unearned advantages regardless of my critique. Indeed, participating in whiteness scholarship is itself potentially an additional form of privilege. If you're going to be an academic, it's part of the par for the course. It's not like you can get out of the structure of academia, which has its systemic problems too. So it's pervasive. I mean, that is part of the whole problem, is that you're not, especially in academia, it's old systems that have been set up a long time ago. So I've mentioned this before, but it's like pretentiousness and I guess privilege also have a lot to do with academic philosophy. One of my old professors, he said you can't be poor and do philosophy. It's just there's not enough time in the day to work this hard at. You can't be like poor. If you need to eat, you can't do philosophy. It's too draining. And there's a lot of truth to that. And that man would know. He went through a lot. Oh well. Anywho, pitfalls, individualizing and moralizing racism. Milazzo raises many pertinent critiques of theorizations of racism within the critical philosophy of race, observing that a significant body of work in this domain conceptualizes racism as explicit, intentional acts of discrimination. As Milazzo argues, this conceptualization is problematic because it obfuscates and therefore sustains embedded structural and institutional racism. Conceptualizing racism as an aberrant attitude held by particular individuals creates an artificial distinction between good anti-racists and bad racists, and implies that only racists hold any responsibility for racial inequality. The contrasting position of anti-racists insulates us from the obligation to do anything about racial inequality. Having the correct mindset is enough. The false binary between good anti-racists and bad racists also diverts attention from the racial privilege accruing by both groups. By concealing race privilege, the impetus to act to identify and address this form of racial inequality is again muted. As Milazzo notes, white privilege is also obscured by locating the problems of racism and disadvantage while leaving white privilege unexamined. Focusing on disadvantage allows white to overlook how the practices that we engage in reproduce cultural, material, and symbolic advantages. Because privilege is intimately connected to disadvantage, Milazzo asserts that racism must be examined through a relational lens. Excuse me. In line with numerous scholars in the field, I concur with Milazzo's critique of those who advocate white guilt and white shame as fitting responses to white privilege. The key limitation of effective responses to white privilege is that their exclusive focus on individuals' emotional states precludes identifying and disrupting the structural forces which sustain race privilege regardless of the effective responses of white people. Consequently, this privilege and its complementary disadvantage is reproduced. Moreover, rather than undermining the position of whites, focusing on white guilt or shame positions white people as well-intentioned moral actors. A self-indulgent focus on white feelings recenters white people and enables the material conditions of racial privilege and a disadvantage to be disregarded. Yeah, so if you put everything into like the head of the sort of the privileged people, then it's like, well, you're in their head, but they continue on with their normal lives as their normal privileged lives, and then basically maybe something will happen because of their thoughts about it, but basically everything else is staying the same. So it's sort of pointless. Any sort of, if you're trying to get anything done, making someone maybe feel bad slightly is not really too successful. This absolves white people from any responsibility to act to address racial inequality. Feeling and performing the correct emotion is sufficient. This emphasis on affect without considering social systems suggests that the problem of racism can be solved by white people changing their minds. Focusing on emotional responses enables white people to avoid acknowledging or addressing our privilege as well as non-white disadvantage. This is a privilege of whiteness. White people's privileged position in the racial hierarchy allows us to ignore the materiality of racism which results in divergent lived experiences in the domains of health, education, employment, housing, and income, to name a few. As Milazzo notes sardonically, white souls can be saved and whiteness redeemed at the same time as most black people continue to live in poverty. Milazzo's statement highlights a further implication of focusing on white effective responses. Whiteness is redeemed, at least for some whites. Yeah, well, this sort of redemption language, I mean, you can go to the sort of the Christian history of this stuff too, I believe. I've heard arguments to the effect that basically the sort of having the right state of mind, the right relationship with God in some sense is how you get redeemed. And so this may be pulling on a religious tradition also. But again, not an expert in this, so I take that with a grain of salt. The theme of white redemption via affect is explicated by Ahmed, who notes the temporary nature of the negative emotion. Ahmed observes that feeling ashamed about racist events allows whites to position themselves in opposition to these events and thus to transcend them. Our shame shows that we mean well. Meaning well, that's nice. The transfer of bad feelings to the subject in this admission of shame is only temporary. Excuse me. My apologies for that. I forgot to mute my phone. The transference of bad feelings to the subject in this admission of shame is only temporary, as the transference itself becomes evidence of the restoration of an identity of which we can be proud. Guilt and shame work to negate complicity with the privileges of whiteness and position racism as property of unreflexive white people. Acknowledging fault acts to redeem the white person while failing to have any tangible impact on racial inequality. Focusing on white affect erases these individuals' participation in the social and ideological networks which reinscribe racialized privilege and disadvantage regardless of the attitude held or emotions experienced. Hence, as Milazzo asserts, calls for guilt or shame are detrimental to the achievement of racial equality. Yeah, because there's no material, so it's like, if you're looking for tangible things, tangible impact on racial inequality, you're not gonna, thoughts and prayers don't go very far. Throwing out the baby with the bathwater. As detailed above, I concur with Milazzo's description of white guilt and white shame as pitfalls in the endeavor to dismantle racial inequality. However, I disagree that the remaining concepts Milazzo lists, white privilege, white habits, white invisibility, and white ignorance, are similarly problematic. Treating these latter concepts as synonymous with white guilt and white shame obscures crucial differences between them. Milazzo's objective of highlighting white people's active investment in maintaining the racialized status quo produces an individualized and moralized reading of white privilege, white habits, white invisibility, and white ignorance. This reading conflicts with her critique of this type of approach when applied to white guilt and white shame and fails to adequately recognize or address the social structures which maintain racial inequality. I argue that literature both within and beyond critical philosophy of race deploys concepts such as white privilege and white ignorance to expose rather than conceal whites' active investment in maintaining the status quo. These points are developed in the following sections covering white privilege, white invisibility, and white ignorance in turn. Alright, so I guess the argument here is that these latter properties, privilege, habits, invisibility, and ignorance, are being treated as derivative of the other, like white shame and guilt, when the author here is arguing that's not so. So the Milazzo, I think they're taking this to the white guilt and shame are more fundamental in some sense, and the rest of these sort of fall out of that. So we'll see, but that's kind of the sense I'm getting. What there's like a the author here is critiquing the fundamentality of or what's given priority in the analysis here. Okay, so white privilege. I concur with Milazzo's statement that white privilege is actively reproduced in the present and manifests itself most strikingly in white people's economic, political, social, and symbolic benefits, yet is denied by many whites. However, I dispute Milazzo's claim that privilege is necessarily the result of conscious behavior. Milazzo contests accounts which equate privilege as unconscious or preconscious habits, arguing that whiteness is perpetuated by white people's active interest in maintaining power. According to Milazzo, white people are the problem. For instance, Milazzo argues that white racial consciousness is instrumental for ensuring that reproduction of white privilege. This perspective conflates whiteness with white bodies while dismissing the reproduction of privilege and disadvantage via social structures. Although Milazzo references institutionalization of whiteness, she explicitly excludes social structures as causal factors for generating white privilege and non-white disadvantage. For example, Milazzo critiques accounts in which privilege is theorized as perpetuated by whiteness itself rather than white people's actions and choices. Similarly, she contests the idea that whiteness is reproduced by a larger entity that seemingly operates outside of white people's control. In this way, Milazzo connects privilege to some intrinsic aspect of whiteness rather than to the social systems that sustain it. Milazzo's individualized understanding of the process which generates white privilege is not supported within the field of critical whiteness studies, in which whiteness is defined as unmarked and unnamed structures which maintain white cultural dominance. White privilege accrues to those who, irrespective of skin color, willingly or unwillingly, knowingly or unknowingly, benefit from these racialized social structures. By following on white people's active interests, Milazzo overlooks a crucial aspect of power, the normative aspect that sustains racialized privilege and disadvantage. Although Milazzo acknowledges white people's collective responsibility for creating and perpetuating institutional racism, and is critical of scholarship that gives the impression that mere shifts in individual behavior can combat racial inequality, she defaults to individualizing and moralizing racial inequality. For example, Milazzo suggests that individual whites can simply give up their privilege. One morally appropriate reaction to privilege would be to relinquish some of the material benefits of whiteness. However, the inability to merely step aside from the privilege of whiteness is widely accepted within critical whiteness studies. Racialized privilege and disadvantage are considered to result from social structures and be beyond the control of individual whites. For instance, Leonardo, one of the authors cited by Milazzo, states that all whites benefit from racist actions whether or not they commit them, and despite the fact that they may work against them. Similarly, Nakayama and Krizek argue that there is little room for maneuvering out of the power relations embedded in whiteness, regardless of whether people discursively position themselves as white. Yeah, you're not escaping the government. Like, if the government's got, say, like a racist tax structure, I mean, you're benefiting from that. You can't you can give up some of your money, but you're still benefiting from the racist tax structure, basically. You can't escape that. That's the government. You'd have to do some big structural change to change how taxes or the laws are passed. Okay. Privileges do not exist separate from the social context which produces them. The social structures which entrench white racial dominance shape the lives of those who are privileged as well as those who are disadvantaged by whiteness. Hence, Jensingham, I apologize for how I pronounce people's names, argued that representing whiteness as if it can be abolished is simplistic. Milazzo's call for white people to relinquish their privilege overstates white people's agency. Yeah, I can't change the IRS. Indeed, she is critical of, I could try, but it'd be real hard for me to do it. Indeed, she is critical of scholarship that sidelines white people's agency in practice. However, Milazzo's approach minimizes and obscures the social structures that maintain white privilege. A more productive approach is to examine how structures privilege some people while disadvantaging others and work towards dismantling these mechanisms. Scholars in the field assert that white privilege thrives by being unmarked. Hence, these scholars advocate naming white privilege as a way of illuminating the unearned advantages received by those who benefit from whiteness. For these scholars, white privilege is a valuable concept which enables the theoretical gaze to be turned away from the disadvantaged other in order to disrupt the normativity of whiteness. Yeah, a different paper I was reading was talking about how basically there's tax breaks given to rich people, and you can say, well, look, it's not inherently, you could be black and you could be rich and it would benefit you, but overall, it benefited the rich people in the past when there were racist laws, and that just sort of propagated through the society, and it still exists here, and so all the people who were rich in the past, who were all the old white people, are still rich because that's how they set the laws up to be. Even though it doesn't look explicitly as racist now, it just propagated the old racism. So it's not like, and they don't care about anybody else, so they want to keep it that way. So it's not like it is a whole social thing tied up with that. It's not like one person could be like, well, we're not going to follow that law, you get thrown in jail. Or you just, you don't take advantage of it. It's not like, who has money anyway? So let's see, anything else to be said about this? Which one is this? White privilege? Alright. No, I'm not sure. I mean, the question is, I of course I have not, I don't know Milazzo's work, but the question is exactly how do you resist here? And so you have to sort of identify this sort of thing. And so it's like you have to identify these sort of laws, like say a tax law that doesn't appear racist, but it actually is racist. Same thing, I was reading Algorithms of Oppression. Like people say the sort of computer algorithms are neutral, but that's not true. They've been based off of old racist ideas back in the day, and then they're just continuing that through now. So you have to identify and name those things to actually start changing them. And so that's important. Okay, white invisibility. Milazzo's critique of white invisibility is marred by conceptual slippage between white invisibility and white ignorance. Milazzo claims that acknowledging that white South Africans are widely aware of their whiteness challenges the concept of white ignorance. This conceptualization of ignorance equates it with an absence of knowledge. However, in the literature, ignorance is theorized as an epistemology, that is, a form of knowledge. In this section, I discuss white invisibility. White ignorance is explicated in the following section. Okay, yeah, so there's a bunch of work on this. I don't know it, but I've seen some of it. White people's overall lack of cognizance of whiteness is known as white invisibility. This is conceptually distinct from white ignorance. White people's unawareness of whiteness is widely discussed in the literature. Frankenberg, one of the seminal authors in the revival of whiteness studies in the 1990s, asserts, whiteness as a set of normative cultural practices is visible most clearly to those it definitively excludes and those to whom it does violence. Those who are securely housed within its borders usually do not examine it. It's like the fish doesn't know it's in water, and we don't feel the air. It just sort of keeps you where you are. As this extract suggests, it's not that white people are unable to see whiteness, rather that we usually lack the necessary ontological framework to perceive it. Similarly, Mills explains with regard to white dominance being achieved at the expense of non-white peoples, most whites don't think about it, or if they do, accept it as the way things are. The concept of white invisibility is a tool that can expand white people's ontological framework in order to disrupt their hour enculturation and obliviousness to whiteness. While people's overall failure to recognize whiteness reflects a broader principle in which normative states of existence are theorized as imperceptible to those who inhabit them. As Dyer, this is what I meant by the fish in water. As Dyer explains, those who occupy positions of cultural hegemony experience their worldview as neutral and unsituated, human, not raced. Yeah, you just sort of think you're, this is just the way things are. You don't realize this is the way your group as the powerful group is. Consequently, white people who live in white-dominated polities do not question our place in the social world because we do not experience the self-doubts about identity that many people of color go through in their search for belonging. As Milazzo, citing Outlaw, notes, most white people are able to take their whiteness for granted. Based on this understanding, scholars in the field advocating naming whiteness in order to disrupt it from its normative position. In contrast, Milazzo portrays white invisibility as a charade, implying that it is a conscious choice. This results in critiquing individual white people rather than examining and disrupting whiteness at a structural level, such as by exploring the process by which whiteness is normalized. This is just sort of like the hegemonic sort of structure. It's like just the way things are. I mean, this is like a bigger problem than just whiteness. Of course, it applies here. But any sort of dominant sort of thing, you sort of get used to it. But I used to be more concerned with like philosophy of science. I've looked at some of that stuff. And so whenever you're in like sort of a research paradigm, it's called. It's like when you're in the thing, you're just in that, and that's sort of the normal way it's done until it eventually gets overthrown, which is a different sort of thing. But it's like the structure of being in a big sort of research program, one big group, that is just what normal becomes, and you don't see it as something that's changing over time or changeable. So, yeah, this is a bigger problem of how to understand like the sociology of powerful groups. Critiquing individual white people is a distraction. Not only is it notoriously difficult to distinguish internalized from strategic dimensions of expressed behavior, white dominance is reproduced either way. Racialized enculturation results in the reinscription of racial norms, regardless of whether white invisibility is due to white people's inability or unwillingness to recognize whiteness. Moreover, rather than a pitfall, white invisibility is a useful conceptual tool. For example, Jay and Singham argues that the trope of whiteness is as invisibility is highly productive as a way of conceptualizing white dominance generally. Whiteness is normalized and white dominance sustained by the unmarked nature of whiteness. As Dyer explains, by attributing racial categories solely to non-white peoples, white people become simply people or the human norm. He argues that there is no more powerful position than that of being just human. As this example illustrates, white people benefit from remaining oblivious to whiteness. As the old quote, the best trick the devil ever pulled was convincing people he didn't exist. It's like, that's the whole thing. This sort of, the illusion of non-existence is aspect of power. As this example illustrates, white people benefit from remaining oblivious to whiteness. However, as the authors cited above note, white people are not necessarily conscious, conspiring to maintain a facade of obliviousness. This produces an apparent contradiction between whiteness as invisible to whites and whites as active agents in reinscribing white privilege. This dilemma can be resolved through theoretical concepts of white ignorance, which I now turn. I guess. I mean, yeah, that makes some sense. I mean, you're going to have some sort of culture, and you're going to sort of propagate your culture, whether you understand it or not. And so, in some sense, you won't realize what you're doing as a propagating the dominant culture, the white culture, I guess. And so that, yeah, so you have to at least understand what's going on, but you're gonna, just by doing certain cultural things, because we all just do, that's part of how we're raised, we grow up and we do stuff, that does have an effect, and you won't necessarily know it. You just be like, well, that's just how what we do, this is like how things are done, and you won't realize that these sort of what you think might be innocuous may not be so innocuous. Okie dokie. Continuing, white ignorance. As noted above, Milazzo draws on popular rather than scholarly understandings of white ignorance, in which white ignorance is equated with unawareness. For example, Milazzo distinguishes between white ignorance and white knowledge in her critique of Mills. However, the term white ignorance, as is theorized by scholars in the field of agnotology, ignorance theory, is much more than simply unknowing. Indeed, Mills refers to ignorance as an epistemology, a way of knowing. The popular understanding of ignorance as a steady retreating frontier of the not yet known in the face of the expanding knowledge is contested by ignorance theorists. Rather than a void, ignorance is theorized to be replete with content. Ignorance may be classified into three types: a pre-knowledge state, a lost realm of selective choice and inattention, and a strategic ploy which is deliberately engineered, maintained, and manipulated. In other words, ignorance may be genuine, tacit, structural, or willful. As noted above regarding white invisibility, it is important to note that determining if ignorance is genuine, tacit, or genuine is irrelevant and unhelpful. The outcome, white dominance, is reproduced regardless. Rather than focusing on intentions, it is more productive to focus on the structural forces which perpetuate white ignorance. Ignorance is not simply the apolitical absence of knowledge, whereas genuine ignorance reflects an absence or void of knowledge. Both tacit and willful ignorance intimate content. As Stein asserts, the relationship between knowledge and ignorance is not one of presence and absence, but of two types of presences, both of which are the product of deliberate practices. But as a productive asset, ignorance may be deliberately cultivated rather than resisted. For Mills, white ignorance is systematically produced and is psychologically and socially functional. The functionality of white ignorance suggests that white people have an active interest in maintaining this interest. Ignorance, yeah, it's the old quote, very hard to convince somebody of something when their paycheck depends on them not understanding it. I mean, they just won't, they won't listen. For example, the epistemologies of ignorance, central to whiteness, function as a form of social amnesia, which allow white people to ignore our implications in systems of privilege and disadvantage. Yet people really, really, really don't like to hear that they didn't earn what they got. They really don't like to hear that. You can see it quite often, very obviously, when someone's trying to resist that. This enables these systems and their accompanying outcomes to be maintained while simultaneously positioning whites as innocent of complicity in systemic maintenance of these systems. However, identifying and demonstrating how white ignorance functions in this way disrupts this pattern. As such, white ignorance as a conceptual tool enables the apparent contradiction between white people's unknowing and our active interest in maintaining the racialized status quo to be resolved. In a similar way to white privilege, white ignorance is a tool which enables white people to understand and challenge their enculturation. At a societal level, the concept of white ignorance enables the processes which generate and sustain white ignorance and innocence to be identified and disrupted. For example, Stein explores the presence of epistemologies of ignorance in South Africans' recollection of apartheid. Excuse me. Crucially, however, Stein disputes the idea of ignorance as a mere failure of objectivity or methodology. Rather, she asserts that ignorance is a social achievement with strategic value, which requires careful education. Examining this education enables these processes to be explored and interrupted. Yeah, again, if it's better for you to believe something, if it's more useful in some sense, it gives you some benefit to forget something, you will forget in some sense. It's very hard to, it's surprising when you realize these things. Like you notice, like I didn't want to remember that, and so you didn't. Milazzo cites Leonardo to argue that white people's behavior is intentional and deliberate. For Leonardo, however, knowledge is not so necessarily conscious. By knowing, I do not suggest a conscious, self-present mode of thinking, but rather a social condition of knowledge, sometimes buried in the unconscious, sometimes percolating to the level of consciousness. Leonardo attributes this to enculturation in a society where white people do not have to think about what it means to be white. Thus, Leonardo's conceptualization of white knowledge is far more nuanced than Milazzo's portrayal of white people's deliberate, intentional actions to serve their interests. Mills argues that white ignorance is not inadvertent. However, he concurs with Stein and Leonardo's focus on the structural forces which enculturate white people as ignorant. For Mills, ignorance is, in no way accidental, but prescribed by the terms of the racial contract, which requires a certain schedule of structured blindness and opacities in order to establish and maintain the white polity. For all these scholars in the field, ignorance is generally generated systemically. Although they all recognize that white people benefit from our ignorance, they argue that ignorance is not necessarily a conscious charade. Milazzo overlooks these scholars in their conclusion that there is a tension between white ignorance theorized in political and philosophical scholarship and white people's active interest in maintaining white dominance that is visible everywhere around us. In contrast, I argue that the two concepts are not contradictory but synergistic. White ignorance is a crucial mechanism by which white people maintain their racial dominance. As such, rather than following Milazzo's advice to rethink invisibility and ignorance as privileged frames for understanding white ontology and epistemology, I suggest that deploying these concepts can expose and disrupt normative mechanisms which maintain white dominance. Conclusion. In this article, I argue for the continuing relevance of white privilege, white invisibility, and white ignorance as conceptual tools for the project of decolonialization. All three concepts identify and thereby expose aspects of whiteness, enabling their contribution to the normativity that entrenches white dominance to be interrupted. I contest Milazzo's problematization of these concepts within critical philosophy of race. Milazzo's critique is based on her assertion that these concepts share limitations to white guilt and white shame. According to Milazzo, all these concepts minimize white people's active interest in reproducing the racist status quo. Milazzo positions herself in opposition to this by emphasizing white people's active interest in maintaining the white dominance. I argue that there are two main limitations to Milazzo's analysis. Firstly, treating white privilege, white invisibility, and white ignorance as synonymous with white guilt and white shame obscures crucial difference between these two sets of concepts. Secondly, Milazzo's focus on highlighting white people's active investment in maintaining the racial status quo precludes a structural analysis. Milazzo critiques conceptualizations of racism as explicit intentional acts. This conceptualization limits white people's responsibility for addressing racism to preventing these explicit acts, leaving the structural forces which maintain racial inequalities unexamined. For example, in the context of her critique of effective responses to racial injustice, Milazzo notes that framing racism as a moral dilemma does not readily allow us to grasp the complex workings of structural racism. As she argues, providing individualistic explanations for structural problems sustains white dominance. Despite occasional references to social structures, however, overall Milazzo adopts an individualizing or moralizing perspective on the perpetuation of racism. For example, her emphasis on white people's active interest in maintaining racial inequality leads her to advocate changes in individual behavior. While Milazzo is correct to assert that racial inequality is actively produced, she interprets this activity as resulting from conscious intention. This leads her to problematize white people rather than social structures. This focus is disputed by authors such as Essed. In order to expose racism in the system, it does not make sense to fight people to wonder whether he or she is racist. It is relevant to focus on when, where, and how racism operates through everyday life, how and when ordinary situations become racist situations. There is no structural racism without everyday racism. As Essed asserts, racial inequality is reproduced by normative or everyday behavior that can occur without conscious intent. Hence, ascertaining innocence or guilt is irrelevant. I am not seeking to redeem white people or portray us as innocent. My analysis of white privilege, white invisibility, and white ignorance clearly implicates white people in the reproduction of racial inequality. However, I concur with scholars in the field who consider investigation of white intent to be unhelpful, as it precludes analysis of the patterned behaviors which reproduce inequality regardless of intent. Examining the normative practices of everyday life allows consideration of the invisible and hegemonic ways in which power generally operates. Social structures are self-perpetuating to the extent that they tend to reproduce pattern behaviors. My aim is to refocus on and disrupt these pattern behaviors. A close reading of the literature reveals that there is no contradiction between white invisibility, white ignorance, and white people's active interest in maintaining racial inequality. I contend that white privilege, white invisibility, and white ignorance are powerful conceptual tools which can reveal white people's active investment in maintaining the racial status quo and simultaneously contribute to dismantling the social structures which enculturate those of us who are white to reproduce this inequality. Okie doke. Sometimes I read papers that are reviews and the people are like, this person is great and I love their work, but they made a mistake here. This is not that paper. This one is like, this person isn't right and I'm going to show you all the ways in which they're not right. So I've one or two of these I've gotten through before where the target of the paper, I mean, it looks like there's some restraint going on here. They want to say the person is terrible, but they focus on the arguments because they're good philosophers. Okay, so that is another question. Sometimes it is worth it just to attack a person, but usually it's not. It's a very hard thing to pull off. Okay, anything to be said about this? If you look at again, since I do a little bit of argument analysis on these. If you look at, like I said, the argument analysis here, they were talking about how the individualization of the problem of the racism and individualization and like sort of essentialization, making it part of the moralization of like the psychology, is really what the failure of the target here. By doing that, it sort of, again, misses the forest for the trees, and in some sense, it's over reliance on the psychologization of the racist attitude, because as this author pointed out, there's a problem with sort of looking at the intent or maybe even the psychology that has to go along with racism. You don't have to have sort of a racist psychology to just propagate heinous like racist practices. I mean, you could just be doing it and not knowing why, and then you have to get it pointed out to you, say because of systemic white ignorance in this case, of the structure of ignorance, that you were never shown that you were doing something bad, and then it has to be pointed out to you because it was in some sense you were manufactured to, not manufactured, but you were enculturated to do certain things without even knowing it. So it's like you grew up using certain words, it was just the way things were, and it turns out those words were very hurtful, and you did not realize you were saying terrible things, and it basically was putting other people down. But since you lived in a culture like that and everyone was doing it, you didn't realize it. So it's like just a junky example, but it's still very common that you grow up and you hear certain words and you don't realize that it's all part of a whole bigger scheme that's well beyond you, that has been sort of like created to keep the people in power in power. You get stuff like that from a Marxist analysis too, a lot of times about capitalism. So the question is, if you were going to argue against that, you can't put that into the individual person, because it is not an individual person thing. That the person has those attitudes and those that culture by forces that are much, much bigger than them. They're like the society basically had to put that into the people that wasn't there to begin with. So you can't so that this is the ignorance and the sort of invisibility that comes through. It's just the way things are. You don't notice things when everything around you is that way. And so then that leads you to just not know at all that what you're doing is perhaps just terrible. Alright, so let's see. Now the question is exactly, see, I don't know exactly Milazzo's argument, of course, but how did they get to their concepts of white guilt and shame, and why would they privilege those concepts over these other ones? I don't know. But this argument, this author took Milazzo to task for that. Throwing out the baby with the bathwater. This is always a fun phrase. Yeah. Alright, so... Okay, so if anyone has any questions out there, I don't know if I have a whole lot more to say. It's just, this is a very good point that if you are going to take on big problems, the big problems do not exist in any person's head. That's not like the right target. That's one token of a larger type of problem, and you have to go for the general societal issues that are going, that's where the problem is. Not with just one person, because one person is just a result of the overall structure of things. Okie dokie. Of course there's some real jerks and we have to get rid of them, but that's not like this sort of stuff. That said, everyone please stay safe out there and have a good night. I will be back tomorrow with another paper. So, have a good night and stay safe, please. Bye-bye.